which is Loaves, by O. Henry. Miss Martha Meacham kept the little bakery on the corner, the one where you go up 3 steps, and the bell tinkles when you open the door. Miss Martha was 40, her bank book showed a credit of $2,000, and she possessed 2 false teeth and a sympathetic heart. Many people have married whose chances to do so were much inferior to Miss Martha's. 2 or 3 times a week a customer came in whom she began to take an interest. He was a middle-aged man, wearing spectacles and a brown beard trimmed to a careful point. He spoke English with a strong German accent. His clothes were worn and darned in places, and wrinkled and baggy in others. But he looked neat, and had very good manners. He always bought 2 loaves of stale bread. Fresh bread was 5 cents a loaf. Stale ones were 2 for 5. Never did he call for anything but stale bread. Once Miss Martha saw a red and brown stain on his fingers. She was sure then that he was an artist and very poor. No doubt he lived in a garret, where he painted pictures and ate stale bread, and thought of the good things to eat in Miss Martha's bakery. Often when Miss Martha sat down to her chops and light rolls and jam and tea she would sigh, and wish that the gentle-mannered artist might share her tasty meal instead of eating his dry crust in that draughty attic. Miss Martha's heart, as you have been told, was a sympathetic one. In order to test her theory as to his occupation, she brought from her room one day a painting that she had bought at a sale and set it against the shelves behind the bread counter. It was a Venetian scene, a splendid marble palazzo, so it said on the picture, stood in the foreground, or rather forewater. For the rest there were gondolas, with the lady trailing her hand in the water, clouds, sky, and chiaroscuro in plenty. No artist could fail to notice it. 2 days afterward the customer came in. 2 loaves of stale bread, if you please. You have here a fine picture, madam, he said while she was wrapping up the bread. Yes, says Miss Martha, reveling in her own cunning. I do so admire art, and no, it would not do to say artists thus early, and paintings, she substituted. You think it is a good picture? Der balance, said the customer, is not in good drawing. Der perspective of it is not true. Good morning, madam. He took his bread, bowed, and hurried out. Yes, he must be an artist. Miss Martha took the picture back to her room. How gentle and kindly his eyes shone behind his spectacles. What a broad brow he had. To be able to judge perspective at a glance, and to live on stale bread. But genius often has to struggle before it is recognized. What a thing it would be for art and perspective if genius were backed by $2,000 in bank, a bakery, and a sympathetic heart too. But these were daydreams, Miss Martha. Often now when he came he would chat for a while across the showcase. He seemed to crave Miss Martha's cheerful words. He kept on buying stale bread. Never a cake, never a pie, never one of her delicious Sally Lunns. She thought he began to look thinner and discouraged. Her heart ached to add something good to eat to his meager purchase, but her courage failed at the act. She did not dare affront him. She knew the pride of artists. Miss Martha took to wearing her blue-dotted silk waist behind the counter. In the back room she cooked a mysterious compound of quince seeds and borax. Ever so many people use it for the complexion. One day the customer came in as usual, laid his nickel on the showcase, and called for his stale loaves. While Miss Martha was reaching for them there was a great tooting and clanging, and a fire engine came lumbering past. The customer hurried to the door to look, as anyone will. Suddenly inspired, Miss Martha seized the opportunity. On the bottom shelf behind the counter was a pound of fresh butter that the dairyman had left 10 minutes before. With a bread knife, Miss Martha made a deep slash in each of the stale loaves, inserted a generous quantity of butter, and pressed the loaves tight again. When the customer turned once more, she was tying the paper around them. When he had gone, after an unusually pleasant little chat, Miss Martha smiled to herself, but not without a slight fluttering of the heart. Had she been too bold? Would he take offense? But surely not. There was no language of edibles. Butter was no emblem of unmaidenly forwardness. For a long time that day her mind dwelt on the subject. She imagined the scene when he should discover her little deception. He would lay down his brushes and palette. There would stand his easel with the picture he was painting in which the perspective was beyond criticism. He would prepare for his luncheon of dry bread and water. He would slice into a loaf. Miss Martha blushed. Would he think of the hand that placed it there as he ate? Would he? The front doorbell jangled viciously. Somebody was coming in, making a great deal of noise. Miss Martha hurried to the front. Two men were there. One was a young man smoking a pipe, a man she had never seen before. The other was her artist. His face was very red. His hat was on the back of his head. His hair was wildly rumpled. He clenched his two fists and shook them ferociously at Miss Martha. At Miss Martha. Dummkopf, he shouted with extreme loudness, and then Tausendonfer, or something like it in German. The young man tried to draw him away. I will not go, he said angrily, else I shall told her. He made a bass drum of Miss Martha's counter. You have spoilt me, he cried, his blue eyes blazing behind his spectacles. I will tell you. You vas von medding some old cat. Miss Martha leaned weakly against the shelves and laid one hand on her blue-dotted silk waist. The young man took the other by the collar. Come on, he said, you've said enough. He dragged the angry one out at the door to the sidewalk and then came back. Guess you ought to be told, ma'am, he said, what the row is about. That's Bloomberger. He's an architectural draftsman. I work in the same office with him. He's been working hard for 3 months drawing a plan for a new city hall. It was a prize competition. He finished inking the lines yesterday. You know, a draftsman always makes his drawing in pencil first. When it's done, he rubs out the pencil lines with handfuls of stale breadcrumbs. That's better than India rubber. Bloomberger's been buying the bread here. Well, today, you know, ma'am, that butter isn't, Bloomberger's plan isn't good for anything now except to cut up into railroad sandwiches. Miss Martha went into the back room. She took off the blue-dotted silk waist and put on the old brown serge she used to wear. Then she poured the quinseed and borax mixture out of the window into the ash can. Whistling Dick's Christmas Stocking by O. Henry. It was with much caution that Whistling Dick slid back the door of the boxcar, for Article 5716, City Ordinances, authorized, perhaps unconstitutionally, arrest on suspicion, and he was familiar of old with this ordinance. So, before climbing out, he surveyed the field with all the care of a good general. He saw no change since his last visit to this big, almsgiving, long, suffering city of the South, the cold-weather paradise of the tramps. The levee where his freight car stood was pimpled with dark bulks of merchandise. The breeze reeked with the well-remembered, sickening smell of the old tarpaulins that covered bales and barrels. The Dun River slipped along among the shipping with an oily gurgle. Far down toward Chalmette, he could see the great bend in the stream outlined by the row of electric lights. Across the river Algiers lay, a long, irregular blot, made darker by the dawn which lightened the sky beyond. An industrious tug or two, coming for some early sailing ship, gave a few appalling toots that seemed to be the signal for breaking day. The Italian luggers were creeping nearer their landing, laden with early vegetables and shellfish. A vague roar, subterranean in quality, from dray wheels and street cars, began to make itself heard and felt, and the ferryboats, the Mary Anns of watercraft, stirred sullenly to their menial morning tasks. Whistling Dick's red head popped suddenly back into the car. A sight too imposing and magnificent for his gaze had been added to the scene. A vast, incomparable policeman rounded a pile of rice sacks and stood within 20 yards of the car. The daily miracle of the dawn, now being performed above Algiers, received the flattering attention of this specimen of municipal official splendor. He gazed with unbiased dignity at the faintly glowing colors until, at last, he turned to them his broad back, as if convinced that legal interference was not needed, and the sunrise might proceed unchecked. So he turned his face to the rice bags, and drawing a flat flask from an inside pocket, he placed it to his lips and regarded the firmament. Whistling Dick, professional tramp, possessed a half-friendly acquaintance with this officer. They had met several times before on the levee at night, for the officer, himself a lover of music, had been attracted by the exquisite whistling of the shiftless vagabond. Still, he did not care, under the present circumstances, to renew the acquaintance. There is a difference between meeting a policeman on a lonely wharf and whistling a few operatic airs with him and being caught by him crawling out of a freight car. So Dick waited. As even a New Orleans policeman must move on some time, perhaps it is a retributive law of nature. And before long, Big Fritz majestically disappeared between the trains of cars. Whistling Dick waited as long as his judgment advised, and then slid swiftly to the ground. Assuming as far as possible the air of an honest laborer who seeks his daily toil, he moved across the network of railway lines, with the intention of making his way by quiet Girard Street to a certain bench in Lafayette Square, where, according to appointment, he hoped to rejoin a pal known as Slick, this adventurous pilgrim having preceded him by one day in a cattle car into which a loose slat had enticed him. As Whistling Dick picked his way where night still lingered among the big, reeking, musty warehouses, he gave way to the habit that had won for him his title. Subdued, yet clear, with each note as true and liquid as a bobolink's, his whistle tinkled about the dim, cold mountains of brick like drops of rain falling into a hidden pool. He followed an air, but it swam mistily into a swirling current of improvisation. You could cull out the trill of mountain brooks, the staccato of green rushes shivering above chilly lagoons, the pipe of sleepy birds. Rounding a corner, the whistler collided with a mountain of blue and brass. "So," observed the mountain calmly, "you are already pack. You indy dear will not pee frost before 2 weeks yet. You indy you have forgotten how to whistle." Dear was a valse note in dot last bar. "Watcher know about it," said Whistling Dick with tentative familiarity. "You wit your little German band Nick Scummers Chuns. Watcher know about music. Pick your ears and listen again. Here's the way I whistled it, see?" He puckered his lips, but the big policeman held up his hand. "Stop," he said, "you indy learn der right way. You indy learn also'd. A rolling stone can't whistle for a cent." Big Fritz's heavy mustache rounded into a circle, and from its depths came a sound deep and mellow as that from a flute. He repeated a few bars of the air the tramp had been whistling. The rendition was cold, but correct, and he emphasized the note he had taken exception to. "P is P natural, you indy not P vlat. P wider vay, you petter P glad I meet you. Von hour later, you indy I vood have to put you in a gauge to whistle mit der chail perds. Der orders are to bull all der pums after sunrise." To which, to bull der pums everybody mitout fissable means. Dirty days is der price, or $15. Is dat straight, or a game you given me? It's der best tip you ever had. I give it to you peke you sei belief you are not so bad as der rest.
Und Pekause Jugan wissel, der frei sich hutz, besser denn I müself gan.
Don't run against any more policemen around der corners, but go away from town a few days. Good pie. So Madame Orleans had at last grown weary of the strange and ruffled brood that came yearly to nestle beneath her charitable pinions. After the big policeman had departed, Whistling Dick stood for an irresolute minute, feeling all the outraged indignation of a delinquent tenant who is ordered to vacate his premises. He had pictured to himself a day of dreamful ease when he should have joined his pal, a day of lounging on the wharf, munching the bananas and coconuts scattered and unloading the fruit steamers, and then a feast along the free lunch counters from which the easygoing owners were too good-natured or too generous to drive him away, and afterward a pipe in one of the little flowery parks and a snooze in some shady corner of the wharf. But here was a stern order to exile, and one that he knew must be obeyed. So, with a wary eye open from the gleam of brass buttons, he began his retreat toward a rural refuge. A few days in the country need not necessarily prove disastrous. Beyond the possibility of a slight nip of frost, there was no formidable evil to be looked for. However, it was with a depressed spirit that Whistling Dick passed the old French market on his chosen route down the river. For safety's sake, he still presented to the world his portrayal of the part of the worthy artisan on his way to labor. A stallkeeper in the market, undeceived, hailed him by the generic name of his ilk, and Jack halted, taken by surprise. The vendor, melted by this proof of his own acuteness, bestowed a foot of frankfurter and half a loaf, and thus the problem of breakfast was solved. When the streets, from topographical reasons, began to shun the river bank, the exile mounted to the top of the levee, and on its well-trodden path pursued his way. The suburban eye regarded him with cold suspicion. Individuals reflected the stern spirit of the city's heartless edict. He missed the seclusion of the crowded town and the safety he could always find in the multitude. At Chalmette, 6 miles upon his desultory way, there suddenly menaced him a vast and bewildering industry. A new port was being established. The dock was being built. Compresses were going up. Picks and shovels and barrows struck at him like serpents from every side. An arrogant foreman bore down upon him, estimating his muscles with the eye of a recruiting sergeant. Brown men and black men all about him were toiling away. He fled in terror. By noon he had reached the country of the plantations, the great, sad, silent levels bordering the mighty river. He overlooked fields of sugarcane so vast that their farthest limits melted into the sky. The sugar-making season was well advanced, and the cutters were at work. The wagons creaked drearily after them. The Negro teamsters inspired the mules to greater speed with mellow and sonorous imprecations. Dark green groves, blurred by the blue of distance, showed where the plantation houses stood. The tall chimneys of the sugar mills caught the eye miles distant, like lighthouses at sea. At a certain point, Whistling Dick's unerring nose caught the scent of frying fish. Like a pointer to a quail, he made his way down the levee side straight to the camp of a credulous and ancient fisherman, whom he charmed with song and story, so that he dined like an admiral, and then like a philosopher annihilated the worst 3 hours of the day by a nap under the trees. When he awoke and again continued his hegira, a frosty sparkle in the air had succeeded the drowsy warmth of the day, and as this portent of a chilly night translated itself to the brain of Sir Peregrine, he lengthened his stride and bethought him of shelter. He traveled a road that faithfully followed the convolutions of the levee, running along its base, but whither he knew not. Bushes and rank grass crowded it to the wheel ruts, and out of this ambuscade the pests of the lowlands swarmed after him, humming a keen, vicious soprano. And as the night grew nearer, although colder, the whine of the mosquitoes became a greedy, petulant snarl that shut out all other sounds. To his right, against the heavens, he saw a green light moving, and, accompanying it, the masts and funnels of a big incoming steamer, moving as upon a screen at a magic lantern show. And there were mysterious marshes at his left, out of which came queer gurgling cries and a choked croaking. The whistling vagrant struck up a merry warble to offset these melancholy influences, and it is likely that never before, since Pan himself jigged it on his reeds, had such sounds been heard in those depressing solitudes. A distant clatter in the rear quickly developed into the swift beat of horses' hoofs, and Whistling Dick stepped aside into the dew-wet grass to clear the track. Turning his head, he saw approaching a fine team of stylish grays drawing a double surrey. A stout man with a white mustache occupied the front seat, giving all his attention to the rigid lines in his hands. Behind him sat a placid, middle-aged lady and a brilliant-looking girl hardly arrived at young ladyhood. The lap-robe had slipped partly from the knees of the gentleman driving, and Whistling Dick saw 2 stout canvas bags between his feet, bags such as, while loafing in cities, he had seen warily transferred between express wagons and bank doors. The remaining space in the vehicle was filled with parcels of various sizes and shapes. As the surrey swept even with the sidetracked tramp, the bright-eyed girl, seized by some merry, madcap impulse, leaned out toward him with a sweet, dazzling smile, and cried, "Merry Christmas," in a shrill, plaintive treble. Such a thing had not often happened to Whistling Dick, and he felt handicapped in devising the correct response. But lacking time for reflection, he let his instinct decide, and snatching off his battered derby, he rapidly extended it at arm's length, and drew it back with a continuous motion, and shouted a loud, but ceremonious, "Ah, there," after the flying surrey. The sudden movement of the girl had caused one of the parcels to become unwrapped, and something limp and black fell from it into the road. The tramp picked it up, and found it to be a new black silk stocking, long and fine and slender. It crunched crisply, and yet with a luxurious softness, between his fingers. "They're bloomin' little skeezicks," said Whistling Dick, with a broad grin bisecting his freckled face. "W, do you think of dat now? Merry Christmas." Sounded like a cuckoo clock. DTS what she did. Dem guys is swells, too, bet your life. And Derold unstacks dem sacks of dough down under his trotters like they was common as dried apples. Been shopping for Christmas, and the kids lost one of her new socks WOT. She was going to hold up Sandy wid de bloomin' little skizix. Wit her Merry Christmas. What do your tink? Same as to say, hello, Jack, how goes it? And as swell as Fifth of Enoo, and as easy as a blowout in Cincinnati. Whistling Dick folded the stocking carefully and stuffed it into his pocket. It was nearly 2 hours later when he came upon signs of habitation. The buildings of an extensive plantation were brought into view by a turn in the road. He easily selected the planter's residence in a large square building with 2 wings, with numerous good-sized, well-lighted windows and broad verandas running around its full extent. It was set upon a smooth lawn, which was faintly lit by the far-reaching rays of the lamps within. A noble grove surrounded it, and old-fashioned shrubbery grew thickly about the walks and fences. The quarters of the hands and the mill buildings were situated at a distance in the rear. The road was now enclosed on each side by a fence, and presently, as Whistling Dick drew nearer the house, he suddenly stopped and sniffed the air. "If dear ain't a hobo stew cookin' somewhere in dis immediate precinct," he said to himself, "me knows is quit tellin' de trut." Without hesitation, he climbed the fence to windward. He found himself in an apparently disused lot, where piles of old bricks were stacked and rejected, decaying lumber. In a corner, he saw the faint glow of a fire that had become little more than a bed of living coals, and he thought he could see some dim human forms sitting or lying about it. He drew nearer, and by the light of a little blaze that suddenly flared up, he saw plainly the fat figure of a ragged man in an old brown sweater and cap. "Dat man," said Whistling Dick to himself softly, "is a dead ringer for Boston Harry. I'll try him with the high sign." He whistled 1 or 2 bars of a ragtime melody, and the air was immediately taken up and then quickly ended with a peculiar run. The first whistler walked confidently up to the fire. The fat man looked up and spake in a loud, asthmatic wheeze. "Gents, the unexpected but welcome addition to our circle is Mr. Whistling Dick, an old friend of mine for whom I fully vouches. The waiter will lay another cover at once. Mr. W.D. will join us at supper, during which function he will enlighten us in regard to the circumstances that gave us the pleasure of his company." "Chewin' de stuffin' out into dictionary, as usual Boston," said Whistling Dick. "But t ain'ts all de same for de invitation. I guess I finds myself here about de same way as yous guys."
A cop Jimma da tip dis morning.
"Yous workin' on dis farm?" "A guest," said Boston sternly, "shouldn't never insult his entertainers until he's filled up wid grub. 'Tain't good business sense. Workin', but I will restrain myself. We 5 me, Deaf Pete, Blinky, Goggles, and Indiana Tom got put on to this scheme of Noah Orleans to work visiting gentlemen upon her dirty streets, and we hit the road last evening just as the tender hues of twilight had flopped down upon the daisies and things. Blinky, pass the empty oyster can at your left to the empty gentleman at your right." For the next 10 minutes, the gang of roadsters paid their undivided attention to the supper. In an old 5-gallon kerosene can they had cooked a stew of potatoes, meat, and onions, which they partook of from smaller cans they had found scattered about the vacant lot. Whistling Dick had known Boston Harry of old, and knew him to be one of the shrewdest and most successful of his brotherhood. He looked like a prosperous stockdrover or solid merchant from some country village. He was stout and hale, with a ruddy, always smoothly shaven face. His clothes were strong and neat, and he gave special attention to his decent-appearing shoes. During the past 10 years, he had acquired a reputation for working a larger number of successfully managed confidence games than any of his acquaintances, and he had not a day's work to be counted against him. It was rumored among his associates that he had saved a considerable amount of money. The 4 other men were fair specimens of the slinking, ill-clad, noisome genus who carried their labels of suspicious in plain view. After the bottom of the large can had been scraped and pipes lit at the coals, 2 of the men called Boston aside and spake with him lowly and mysteriously. He nodded decisively, and then said aloud to Whistling Dick, "Listen, sonny, to some plain talky-talk. We 5 are on a lay. I've guaranteed you to be square, and you're to come in on the profits equal with the boys, and you've got to help. 200 hands on this plantation are expecting to be paid a week's wages tomorrow morning. Tomorrow's Christmas, and they want to lay off, says the boss. Work from 5 to 9 in the morning to get a trainload of sugar off, and I'll pay every man cash down for the week and a day extra. They say, hooray for the boss. It goes. He drives to New Orleans today and fetches back the cold dollars. $2,074.50 is the amount. I got the figures from a man who talks too much, who got them from the bookkeeper. The boss of this plantation thinks he's going to pay this wealth to the hands. He's got it down wrong. He's going to pay it to us. It's going to stay in the leisure class, where it belongs. Now, half of this haul goes to me, and the other half the rest of you may divide. Why the difference? I represent the brains. It's my scheme. Here's the way we're going to get it. There's some company at supper in the house, but they'll leave about 9. They've just happened in for an hour or so. If they don't go pretty soon, we'll work the scheme anyhow. We want all night to get away good with the dollars. They're heavy. About 9 o'clock, Deaf Pete and Blinky'll go down the road about a quarter beyond the house and set fire to a big cane field there that the cutters haven't touched yet. The wind's just right to have it roaring in 2 minutes. The alarm will be given, and every man jack about the place will be down there in 10 minutes, fighting fire. That'll leave the money sacks and the women alone in the house for us to handle. You've heard cane burn? Well, there's mighty few women can screech loud enough to be heard above its crackling. The thing's dead safe. The only danger is in being caught before we can get far enough away with the money. Now, if you— Boston, interrupted Whistling Dick, rising to his feet. Tanks for the grub yous fellers has given me, but I'll be movin' on now. What do you mean? Asked Boston, also rising. WY, you can count me outer dis deal. You oughter know that. I'm on de bum all right enough, but dat other ting don't go wit me. Burglary is no good. I'll say good night and many tianks fair. Whistling Dick had moved away a few steps as he spoke, but he stopped very suddenly. Boston had covered him with a short revolver of roomy caliber. Take your seat, said the tramp leader. I'd feel mighty proud of myself if I let you go and spoil the game. You'll stick right in this camp until we finish the job. The end of that brick pile is your limit. You go 2 inches beyond that, and I'll have to shoot. Better take it easy now. It's my way of doin', said Whistling Dick. Easy goes. You can depress the muzzle of dat 12-incher and run her back onto trucks. I remains, as the newspaper says, in your midst. All right, said Boston, lowering his piece, as the other returned and took his seat again on a projecting plank in a pile of timber. Don't try to leave, that's all. I wouldn't miss this chance even if I had to shoot an old acquaintance to make it go. I don't want to hurt anybody specially, but this $1,000 I'm going to get will fix me for fair. I'm going to drop the road and start a saloon in a little town I know about. I'm tired of being kicked around. Boston Harry took from his pocket a cheap silver watch and held it near the fire. It's 8:45, he said. Pete, you and Blinky start. Go down the road past the house and fire the cane in a dozen places. Then strike for the levee and come back on it instead of the road, so you won't meet anybody. By the time you get back, the men will all be striking out for the fire, and we'll break for the house and collar the dollars. Everybody cough up what matches he's got. The two surly tramps made a collection of all the matches in the party, Whistling Dick contributing his quota with propitiatory alacrity, and then they departed in the dim starlight in the direction of the road. Of the 3 remaining vagrants, 2, Goggles and Indiana Tom, reclined lazily upon convenient lumber and regarded Whistling Dick with undisguised disfavor. Boston, observing that the dissenting recruit was disposed to remain peaceably, relaxed a little of his vigilance. Whistling Dick arose presently and strolled leisurely up and down, keeping carefully within the territory assigned him. "Dis planter chap," he said, pausing before Boston Harry, "WOT makes your tink he's got de tin in de house wit him?" "I'm advised of the facts in the case," said Boston. "He drove to New Orleans and got it, I say, today. Want to change your mind now and come in?" "Nah, I was just a skin. What kind o' team did de boss drive?" "Pair of grays." "Double Surrey?" "Yep." "Women folks along?" Wife and kid. Say, what morning paper are you trying to pump news for? I was just conversin' to pass the time away. I guess dat team passed me into road this evening. That's all. As Whistling Dick put his hands in his pockets and continued his curtailed beat up and down by the fire, he felt the silk stocking he had picked up in the road. "They're bloomin' little skeezicks," he muttered, with a grin. As he walked up and down he could see, through a sort of natural opening or lane among the trees, the planter's residence some 75 yards distant. The side of the house toward him exhibited spacious, well-lighted windows through which a soft radiance streamed, illuminating the broad veranda and some extent of the lawn beneath. "What's that you said?" asked Boston, sharply. "Oh, nuttin' all," said Whistling Dick, lounging carelessly and kicking meditatively at a little stone on the ground. "Just as easy," continued the warbling vagrant softly to himself, "and sociable and swell and sassy. Wit her Merry Christmas. What do yer t'ink now?" Dinner, 2 hours late, was being served in the Belmead plantation dining room. The dining room and all its appurtenances spoke of an old regime that was here continued rather than suggested to the memory. The plate was rich to the extent that its age and quaintness alone saved it from being showy. There were interesting names signed in the corners of the pictures on the walls. The viands were of the kind that bring a shine into the eyes of gourmets. The service was swift, silent, lavish, as in the days when the waiters were assets like the plate. The names by which the planter's family and their visitors addressed one another were historic in the annals of two nations. Their manners and conversation had that most difficult kind of ease, the kind that still preserves punctilio. The planter himself seemed to be the dynamo that generated the larger portion of the gaiety and wit. The younger ones at the board found it more than difficult to turn back on him his guns of raillery and banter. It is true, the young men attempted to storm his works repeatedly, incited by the hope of gaining the approbation of their fair companions. But even when they sped a well-aimed shaft, the planter forced them to feel defeat by the tremendous discomfiting thunder of the laughter with which he accompanied his retorts. At the head of the table, serene, matronly, benevolent, reigned the mistress of the house, placing here and there the right smile, the right word, the encouraging glance. The talk of the party was too desultory, too evanescent to follow, but at last they came to the subject of the tramp nuisance, one that had of late vexed the plantations for many miles around. The planter seized the occasion to direct his good-natured fire of raillery at the mistress, accusing her of encouraging the plague. "They swarm up and down the river every winter," he said. "They overrun New Orleans, and we catch the surplus, which is generally the worst part. And, a day or two ago, Madame New Orleans, suddenly discovering that she can't go shopping without brushing her skirts against great rows of the vagabonds sunning themselves on the banquettes, says to the police, 'Catch 'em all,' and the police catch a dozen or two, and the remaining 3,000 or 4,000 overflow up and down the levee, and Madame there, pointing tragically with the carving knife at her, feeds them. They won't work, they defy my overseers, and they make friends with my dogs. And you, Madame, feed them before my eyes, and intimidate me when I would interfere. Tell us, please, how many today did you thus incite to future laziness and depredation?" "6, I think," said Madame, with a reflective smile. "But you know 2 of them offered to work, for you heard them yourself." The planter's disconcerting laugh rang out again. "Yes, at their own trades. And one was an artificial flower maker, and the other a glass blower. Oh, they were looking for work. Not a hand would they consent to lift to labor of any other kind. And another one," continued the soft-hearted mistress, "used quite good language. It was really extraordinary for one of his class. And he carried a watch, and had lived in Boston. I don't believe they are all bad. They have always seemed to me to rather lack development. I always look upon them as children with whom wisdom has remained at a standstill while whiskers have continued to grow. We passed one this evening as we were driving home who had a face as good as it was incompetent. He was whistling the intermezzo from Cavalleria and blowing the spirit of Moscagni himself into it. A bright-eyed young girl who sat at the left of the mistress leaned over and said in a confidential undertone, "I wonder, Mamma, If that tramp we passed on the road found my stocking, and do you think he will hang it up tonight? Now I can hang up but one. Do you know why I wanted a new pair of silk stockings when I have plenty? Well, old Aunt Judy says, if you hang up two that have never been worn, Santa Claus will fill one with good things, and Monsieur Pam will place in the other payment for all the words you have spoken good or bad on the day before Christmas. That's why I've been unusually nice and polite to everyone today. Monsieur Pam, you know, is a witch gentleman, he. The words of the young girl were interrupted by a startling thing. Like the wraith of some burned-out shooting star, a black streak came crashing through the window pane and upon the table, where it shivered into fragments a dozen pieces of crystal and china ware, and then glanced between the heads of the guests to the wall, imprinting therein a deep, round indentation, at which, today, the visitor to Belmead marvels as he gazes upon it and listens to this tale as it is told. The women screamed in many keys, and the men sprang to their feet, and would have laid their hands upon their swords had not the verities of chronology forbidden. The planter was the first to act. He sprang to the intruding missile and held it up to view. By Jupiter, he cried, a meteoric shower of hosiery. Has communication at last been established with Mars? I should say a him Venus, ventured a young gentleman visitor, looking hopefully for approbation toward the unresponsive young lady visitors. The planter held at arm's length the unceremonious visitor a long dangling black stocking. It's loaded, he announced. As he spoke, he reversed the stocking, holding it by the toe, and down from it dropped a roundish stone, wrapped about by a piece of yellowish paper. Now for the first interstellar message of the century, he cried, and nodding to the company, who had crowded about him, he adjusted his glasses with provoking deliberation and examined it closely. When he finished, he had changed from the jolly host to the practical, decisive man of business. He immediately struck a bell and said to the silent-footed mulatto man who responded, "Go and tell Mr. Wesley to get Reeves and Maurice and about 10 stout hands they can rely upon, and come to the hall door at once. Tell him to have the men arm themselves, and bring plenty of ropes and plow lines. Tell him to hurry." And then he read aloud from the paper these words. To the gent of de house. Dear as 5 tough hobos sept myself in the vacant lot near de road where de old brick piles is. Dey got me stuck up wid a gun, see, and I taken dis means of communication. 2 of der lads is gone down to set fire to de cane field below de house, and when yous fellers goes to turn de hose on it, de whole gang is going to rob de house of de money you gotta pay off wid say get a move on ye say de kid drop dis sock on de road, tell her Merry Christmas de same as she told me. Catch de bums down de road first and den send a relef corps to get me out of soak yours truly. Whistlin' Dick. There was some quiet, but rapid, manoeuvring at Belmead during the ensuing half-hour, which ended in 5 disgusted and sullen tramps being captured, and locked securely in an outhouse pending the coming of the morning and retribution. For another result, the visiting young gentlemen had secured the unqualified worship of the visiting young ladies by their distinguished and heroic conduct. For still another, behold Whistling Dick, the hero, seated at the planter's table, feasting upon viands his experience had never before included, and waited upon by admiring femininity in shapes of such beauty and swellness that even his ever-full mouth could scarcely prevent him from whistling. He was made to disclose in detail his adventure with the evil gang of Boston Harry, and how he cunningly wrote the note and wrapped it around the stone and placed it at the toe of the stocking, and, watching his chance, sent it silently, with a wonderful centrifugal momentum, like a comet, at one of the big lighted windows of the dining room. The planter vowed that the wanderer should wander no more, that his was a goodness and an honesty that should be rewarded, and that a debt of gratitude had been made that must be paid. For had he not saved them from a doubtless imminent loss, and maybe a greater calamity? He assured Whistling Dick that he might consider himself a charge upon the honor of Belmead, that a position suited to his powers would be found for him at once, and hinted that the way would be heartily smooth for him to rise to as high places of emolument and trust as the plantation afforded. But now, they said, he must be weary, and the immediate thing to consider was rest and sleep. So the mistress spoke to a servant, and Whistling Dick was conducted to a room in the wing of the house occupied by the servants. To this room, in a few minutes, was brought a portable tin bathtub filled with water, which was placed on a piece of oiled cloth upon the floor. There the vagrant was left to pass the night. By the light of a candle he examined the room. A bed, with the covers neatly turned back, revealed snowy pillows and sheets. A worn, but clean, red carpet covered the floor. There was a dresser with a beveled mirror, a washstand with a flowered bowl and pitcher. The 2 or 3 chairs were softly upholstered. A little table held books, papers, and a day-old cluster of roses in a jar. There were towels on a rack and soap in a white dish. Whistling Dick set his candle on a chair and placed his hat carefully under the table. After satisfying what we must suppose to have been his curiosity by a sober scrutiny, he removed his coat, folded it, and laid it upon the floor, near the wall, as far as possible from the unused bathtub. Taking his coat for a pillow, he stretched himself luxuriously upon the carpet. When, on Christmas morning, the first streaks of dawn broke above the marshes, Whistling Dick awoke and reached instinctively for his hat. Then he remembered that the skirts of fortune had swept him into their folds on the night previous, and he went to the window and raised it, to let the fresh breath of the morning cool his brow and fix the yet dreamlike memory of his good luck within his brain. As he stood there, certain dread and ominous sounds pierced the fearful hollow of his ear. The force of plantation workers, eager to complete the shortened task allotted to them, were all astir. The mighty din of the ogre labor shook the earth, and the poor tattered and forever disguised prince in search of his fortune held tight to the window-sill even in the enchanted castle, and trembled. Already from the bosom of the mill came the thunder of rolling barrels of sugar, and, prison-like sounds, there was a great rattling of chains as the mules were harried with stimulant imprecations to their places by the wagon tongues. A little vicious, dummy engine, with a train of flat cars in tow, stewed and fumed on the plantation tap of the narrow-gauge railroad, and a toiling, hurrying, hallooing stream of workers were dimly seen in the half-darkness loading the train with the weekly output of sugar. Here was a poem, an epic, nay, a tragedy, with work, the curse of the world, for its theme. The December air was frosty, but the sweat broke out upon Whistling Dick's face. He thrust his head out of the window and looked down. 15 feet below him, against the wall of the house, he could make out that a border of flowers grew, and by that token he overhung a bed of soft earth. Softly as a burglar goes, he clambered out upon the sill, lowered himself until he hung by his hands alone, and then dropped safely. No one seemed to be about upon this side of the house. He dodged low and skimmed swiftly across the yard to the low fence. It was an easy matter to vault this, for a terror urged him such as lifts the gazelle over the thorn bush when the lion pursues. A crash through the dew-drenched weeds on the roadside, a clutching, slippery rush up the grassy side of the levee to the footpath at the summit, and he was free. The east was blushing and brightening. The wind, himself a vagrant rover, saluted his brother upon the cheek. Some wild geese, high above, gave cry. A rabbit skipped along the path before him, free to turn to the right or to the left as his mood should send him. The river slid past, and certainly no one could tell the ultimate abiding place of its waters. A small, ruffled, brown-breasted bird, sitting upon a dogwood sapling, began a soft, throaty, tender little piping in praise of the dew which entices foolish worms from their holes. But suddenly he stopped and sat with his head turned sidewise, listening. From the path along the levee there burst forth a jubilant, stirring, buoyant, thrilling whistle, loud and keen and clear as the cleanest notes of the piccolo. The soaring sound rippled and trilled and arpeggioed as the songs of wild birds do not, but it had a wild, free grace that, in a way, reminded the small, brown bird of something familiar, but exactly what he could not tell. There was in it the bird call or reveille that all birds know, but a great waste of lavish, unmeaning things that art had added and arranged, besides, and that were quite puzzling and strange. And the little brown bird sat with his head on one side until the sound died away in the distance. The little bird did not know that the part of that strange warbling that he understood was just what kept the warbler without his breakfast. But he knew very well that the part he did not understand did not concern him, So he gave a little flutter of his wings and swooped down like a brown bullet upon a big fat worm that was wriggling along the levee path. While the auto waits. By O. Henry. Promptly at the beginning of twilight, came again to that quiet corner of that quiet, small park the girl in gray. She sat upon a bench and read a book, for there was yet to come a half hour in which print could be accomplished. To repeat, her dress was gray, and plain enough to mask its impecancy of style and fit. A large, meshed veil imprisoned her turban hat and a face that shone through it with a calm and unconscious beauty. She had come there at the same hour on the day previous, and on the day before that, and there was one who knew it. The young man who knew it hovered near, relying upon burnt sacrifices to the great Joss, Luck. His piety was rewarded, for, in turning a page, her book slipped from her fingers and bounded from the bench a full yard away. The young man pounced upon it with instant avid, returning it to its owner with that air that seems to flourish in parks and public places, a compound of gallantry and hope tempered with respect for the policeman on the beat. In a pleasant voice, he risked an inconsequent remark upon the weather that introductory topic responsible for so much of the world's unhappiness and stood poised for an emolument, awaiting his fate. The girl looked him over leisurely, at his ordinary, neat dress and his features distinguished by nothing particular in the way of expression. "You may sit down if you like," she said, in a full, deliberate contralto. "Really, I would like to have you do so. The light is too bad for reading. I would prefer to talk." The vassal of luck slid upon the seat by her side with complaisance. "Do you know," B said, speaking the formula with which park chairmen open their meetings, "that you are quite the stunningest girl I have seen in a long time? I had my eye on you yesterday. Didn't know somebody was bowled over by those pretty lamps of yours, did you, honeysuckle?" "Whoever you are," said the girl in icy tones, "you must remember that I am a lady. I will excuse the remark you have just made because the mistake was, doubtless, not an unnatural one, in your circle. I asked you to sit down. If the invitation must constitute me your honeysuckle, consider it withdrawn." "I earnestly beg your pardon," pleaded the young man. His expression of satisfaction had changed to one of penitence and humility. "It was my fault, there are girls in parks, that is, of course, you don't know, but—" "Abandon the subject, if you please. Of course I know. Now, tell me about these people passing and crowding, each way, along these paths. Where are they going? Why do they hurry so? Are they happy?" The young man had promptly abandoned his air of coquetry. His cue was now for a waiting part. He could not guess the role B would be expected to play. "It is interesting to watch them," he replied, too-lating her mood. "It is the wonderful drama of life. Some are going to supper and some to other places. One wonders what their histories are." "I do not," said the girl. "I am not so inquisitive. I come here to sit because here, only, can I be tear the great, common, throbbing heart of humanity. My part in life is cast where its beats are never felt. Can you surmise why I spoke to you, Mr. Parkenstacker?" supplied the young man. Then he looked eager and hopeful. "No," said the girl, holding up a slender finger and smiling slightly. "You would recognize it immediately. It is impossible to keep one's name out of print, or even one's portrait. This veil and this hat of my maid furnish me with an incognito. You should have seen the chauffeur stare at it when he thought I did not see. Candidly, there are 5 or 6 names that belong in the Holy of Holies, and mine, by the accident of birth, is one of them. I spoke to you, Mr. Stackenpot." "Parkenstacker," corrected the young man, modestly. "Mr. Parkenstacker, because I wanted to talk, for once, with a natural man, one unspoiled by the despicable gloss of wealth and supposed social superiority. Oh, you do not know how weary I am of it. Money, 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 and of the men who surround me, dancing like little marionettes all cut by the same pattern. I am sick of pleasure, of jewels, of travel, of society, of luxuries of all kinds." "I always had an idea," ventured the young man, hesitatingly, "that money must be a pretty good thing. A competence is to be desired. But when you leave so many millions that... She concluded the sentence with a gesture of despair. It is the monotony of it, she continued, that palls. Drives, dinners, theaters, balls, suppers, with the gilding of superfluous wealth over it all. Sometimes the very tinkle of the ice in my champagne glass nearly drives me mad. Mr. Parkenstacker looked ingenuously interested. I have always liked, he said, to read and hear about the ways of wealthy and fashionable folks. I suppose I am a bit of a snob, but I like to have my information accurate. Now, I had formed the opinion that champagne is cooled in the bottle and not by placing ice in the glass. The girl gave a musical laugh of genuine amusement. You should know, she explained in an indulgent tone, that we of the non-useful class depend for our amusement upon departure from precedent. Just now it is a fad to put ice in champagne. The idea was originated by a visiting prince of Tartary while dining at the Waldorf. It will soon give way to some other whim. Just as at a dinner party this week on Madison Avenue, a green kid glove was laid by the plate of each guest to be put on and used while eating olives. I see, admitted the young man humbly. These special diversions of the inner circle do not become familiar to the common public. Sometimes, continued the girl, acknowledging his confession of error by a slight bow, I have thought that if I ever should love a man it would be one of lowly station, one who is a worker and not a drone. But, doubtless, the claims of caste and wealth will prove stronger than my inclination. Just now I am besieged by two. One is a Grand Duke of a German principality. I think he has, or has bad, a wife, somewhere, driven mad by his intemperance and cruelty. The other is an English marquis, so cold and mercenary that I even prefer the diabolism of the Duke. What is it that impels me to tell you these things, Mr. Parkenstacker? Parkenstacker, breathed the young man. Indeed, you cannot know how much I appreciate your confidences. The girl contemplated him with the calm, impersonal regard that befitted the difference in their st tie-ins. What is your line of business, Mr. Parkenstacker? She asked. A very humble one, but I hope to rise in the world. Were you really in earnest when you said that you could love a man of lowly position? Indeed I was. But I said might. There is the Grand Duke and the Marquis, you know. Yes, no calling could be too humble were the man what I would wish him to be. I work, declared Mr. Parkenstacker, in a restaurant. The girl shrank slightly. Not as a waiter, she said, a little imploringly. Labor is noble, but personal attendants, you know, valets and... I am not a waiter. I am cashier in... On the street they faced that bounded the opposite side of the park was the brilliant electric sign, Restaurant. I am cashier in that restaurant you am there. The girl consulted a tiny watch set in a bracelet of rich design upon her left wrist and rose, hurriedly. She thrust her book into a glittering reticule that was pended from her waist, for which, however, the book was too large. Why are you not at work? She asked. I am on the night turn, said the young man. It is yet an hour before my period begins. May I not hope to see you again? I do not know. Perhaps, but the whim may not seize me again. I must go quickly now. There is a dinner, and a box at the play, and, oh, the same old round. Perhaps you noticed an automobile at the upper corner of the park as you came. One with a white body. And red running gear? Asked the young man, knitting his brows reflectively. Yes, I always come in that. Pierre waits for me there. He supposes me to be shopping in the department store across the square. Conceive of the bondage of the life, wherein we must deceive even our chauffeurs. Good night. But it is dark now, said Mr. Parkenstacker, and the park is full of rude men. May I not walk? If you have the slightest regard for my wishes, said the girl firmly, you will remain at this bench for 10 minutes after I have left. I do not mean to accuse you, but you are probably aware that autos generally bear the monogram of their owner. Again, good night. Swift and stately she moved away through the dusk. The young man watched her graceful form as she reached the pavement at the park's edge and turned up along it toward the corner where stood the automobile. Then he treacherously and unhesitated Ingley began to dodge and skim among the park trees and shrubbery in a course parallel to her route, keep under her well in sight. When she reached the corner, she turned her head to glance at the motor car, and then past it, continuing on across the street. Sheltered behind a convenient standing cab, the young man followed her movements closely with his eyes. Passing down the sidewalk of the street opposite the park, she entered the restaurant with the blazing sign. The place was one of those frankly glaring establishments, all white, paint, and glass, where one may dine cheaply and conspicuously. The girl penetrated the restaurant to some retreat at its rear, whence she quickly emerged without her bat and veil. The cashier's desk was well to the front. A red-head girl on the stool climbed down, glancing pointedly at the clock as she did so. The girl in gray mounted in her place. The young man thrust his hands into his pockets and walked slowly back along the sidewalk. At the corner, his foot struck a small, paper-covered volume lying there, sending it sliding to the edge of the turf. By its picturesque cover, he recognized it as the book the girl had been reading. He picked it up carelessly and saw that its title was New Arabian Nights, the author being of the name of Stevenson. He dropped it again upon the grass and lounged irresolute for a minute. Then he stepped into the automobile, reclined upon the cushions, and said 2 words to the chauffeur. Club, Henri.